Stanley Kubrick. There's a certain class of people called perfectionists. You go up to obsessive compulsive after that. Then there's insane. Going on into a class above that is a danger to themselves and others. And then simply a category after that known as Stanley Kubrick. A legend, a top-tier name in the industry, and sometimes even an interesting case study. He's known as one of those directors who would assert complete creative dominance over all of his films, but later in his life he's becoming more and more known as a recluse. Even though he was a private man and usually hid from the world, he was still producing the high-quality films that impact the entire entertainment area, commonly known as Hollywood, still to this day. There's much to be said about the director of some of the most visually appealing works of cinema in all of moving picture history. His work is easily recognizable, and the sheer amount of work he put into the masterpieces that came out of this are incomparable. Special effects that are still believable to this day, incredible cinematography that could cure a blind man, and storylines that are not only entertaining, but make you think. Now, we take an in-depth look at the man in the folding chair. Like many kids, Kubrick was born. He just so happened to be born in the Bronx district of New York on July 26, 1928, sometime after he attended elementary school. But I wouldn't say attend would be the most appropriate word, seeing as his time was split somewhere between 50-50 and I don't want to be there. He wasn't exactly the best kid in school, and his teachers definitely took note of it. His father, a physician, was not exactly pleased with his son's inadequate grades and decided to try to remedy him by sending him away to California in 1940. Upon returning to New York the very next year, his grades did not improve significantly, if even at all. He did, however, develop a passion for jazz and drumming in it, so he went along with that. So ridiculous. Still unhappy with his son's inadequate grades, the good doctor decided to look somewhere else for inspiration for Kubrick. Chess. An intellectual game that his father hoped would spur his excitement for education, and to some extent, it worked. Kubrick became a very competent player and would play in competitions, and eventually he'd play in parks for money. It was also used again and again in films as a reoccurring bit, and even a way to deal with the uncooperative actors. For Kubrick's 13th birthday, he received a camera from his father. This camera was possibly the best thing his father could have done for him, as it led to his eventual success. Kubrick quickly took to the idea of photography and would develop films in his friend's darkroom. Snapping this picture on the day FDR died, he sent it into Look magazine, who bought it. They eventually then offered him a job as a freelance photographer. At only the age of 17, Kubrick was traveling around taking pictures for a magazine. He was a photographer. It was his first job. He took to it greatly and became very involved in photography. While working as a freelance photographer for Look magazine throughout the 40s, he decided to supplement his income by playing chess for money in Greenwich Village. During this time, Kubrick visited the Museum of Modern Art showings often and tried to see as many movies as his busy schedule would permit. This sparked his interest in filmmaking, and his passion grew for many years. In 1951, his career completely switched gears from photography to cinema, and he set out to become the greatest filmmaker of all time.
I wanna be the very best, like no one ever was.
Okay, I made that last part up. But, at just the age of 23, he did go all in to make his first documentary. This documentary, also being his first film work, was a 16-minute boxing documentary about boxer Walter Carter, known as The Day of the Fight. He paid for this completely out of his own pocket. He spent nearly all of his savings producing it. And it was worth it when he caught attention from RKO Pictures, who subsequently commissioned Kubrick for more documentaries. He didn't even fully know how to operate the equipment he rented. The guy he rented it from told him how to use it. But apparently he picked up the idea rather quickly, because he created 2 more documentaries, which became known as Flying Padre, an RKO Path screenliner in 1951, and The Seafarers in 1953. Now these aren't anything special, it's just worthy to note that The Seafarers was Kubrick's first color film. These attracted enough investors to help provide money and support for his next film. However, with that not being enough from the supporters given, he reached out to family for support. He also hustled more games of chess in Central Park, but whatever. Accumulating around $13,000, Kubrick was able to produce his debut film in California, a fictitious war film known as Fear and Desire. Due to the way the dialogue was edited later, that added another $20,000 to the total cost. Clocking in at only 62 minutes, it's not a really long feature film. It's an hour long. That's pretty short. Most movies nowadays are somewhere between an hour and a half to 3 hours. It didn't show very long. It was in New York's art house circuit for just a short period of time. It didn't really even get to make back the money it was cost to produce. The film was a rather depressing time in Kubrick's life, as his current marriage from his high school sweetheart did not survive the shooting. The silver lining in all of this was he got his name out there. He was becoming known as a director, and he was quite good at it. His talent was being found, and people were starting to take notice. Even though the film was the film that got it all started, received mixed reviews from critics, varying from outstanding to even being a critic of himself, he called it a bumbling amateur film exercise. Following the production of Fear and Desire, Kubrick produced two more low-budget films known as Killer's Kiss and The Killing in 1955 and 1956, respectively. Both were similar in genre, as they both were crime thrillers and going on at 67 minutes and 85 minutes of runtime, again, respectively. Killer's Kiss being his sophomore film, it was more readily accepted and eventually sold to United Artists, where it received worldwide attention and viewings. Killer's Kiss was his sophomore film. It's his second film, and even though it was primarily shown as a second viewing in, a double presentation, it got his name out there. He got popular from it. He received attention, and people started, again, taking note of him. The Killing was his first studio picture, and it was based on the novel Clean Break by Lionel White. It was even more successful and brought about the attention of Hollywood. Hollywood? He's into Hollywood? He's made 3 films. 3! And he's already getting the attention of Hollywood. Not even just Hollywood. Big studio pictures. MGM's head wanted him. Yes, I'm not making that up either. MGM's production head, Doris Scher, wanted his work. He partnered him with novelist Carter Willingham for work on future projects. And in 1957, that's just what Kubrick got. He got his first major studio break, directing Paths of Glory starring Kirk Douglas. This movie was a powerful anti-war film, and it was even more successful than that of his last film. Kubrick again was labeled as a rising talent. His directing style and competence were beginning to take shape. Next, Kubrick was then again approached by Kirk Douglas to direct his next film, Spartacus. That was in lieu of Anthony Mann being the last director. They cut him out and they wanted someone different, so they brought in Kubrick. Kirk Douglas and the filming crew hoped that the sheer size of the project would be enough to intimidate Kubrick. But was that enough? In fact, it didn't faze Kubrick in the slightest and began to completely take over the creative ideas and standards of the film. Yes, and although the film went on to be a major hit and huge success, there was much opposition throughout the film crew because of Kubrick's style of directing. This was essentially the really first time that Kubrick got to go out there and show how dictatorial and overbearing he was going to be on projects. He just took over everything from the shooting to the writing to the acting. It all became his. It was all his idea. He essentially made it his Nazi Germany, if you will. Not to say that I'm comparing Kubrick to Hitler, but I am. For instance, cinematographer Russell Meddy complained to the producers that Kubrick was doing his job for him. In proper Kubrick fashion, he turned to Russell Meddy and told him to sit there and do nothing. You tell him what to do, Kubrick. Meddy then, ironically, went on to win the Academy Award for his work. One can only really imagine how future employment went for Meddy. Now listen, Meddy, we really loved your work in Spartacus. Yeah, thanks, but it was just so phenomenal. Your work was clearly unmatched. There was no other movie that could compare that year. You really deserve the award for that cinematography. Yeah, that's great, but... Listen, we're really looking forward to having you work with us on this project. How do you say about it? Look, I really didn't do anything. I kind of just sat there. The director completely took over my job. He kind of just told me to sit there and do nothing. I just got the credit. So you're saying you didn't do any of the work, actually? Not at all. We'll call you. So what did Kubrick do after producing that Hollywood blockbuster? which, by the way, won a freaking Golden Globe Award for Best Picture. Did he go on to be Hollywood's greatest director of all time? That's exactly what he did. He was producing movies for those corporations left and right. He was just going out and wait, hold on. What's that? That's not actually what happened? He got removed from the director's chair? He lost another marriage? He was so dissatisfied with all this, he left the country? Huh. Yes, that's actually what happened. Turns out Kubrick was going to direct Marlon Brando in One-Eyed Jacks in 1961, but Brando decided he wanted to do the film himself and opted to direct it instead, thusly kicking Kubrick to the curb. So stupid. This disillusioned Kubrick to the evil ways of Hollywood, and alongside yet another failed marriage, he decided to permanently move out to England, where he would spend the rest of his life and where he produced the rest of his films. The United Kingdom, home of the Brits, some wonderful people, and now to an aspiring rising talent director. Stanley Kubrick then came back into the game with a film known as Lolita, an interesting love affair. Actually, this idea was based on Vladimir Nabokov, Vladimir Nabokov, whatever. It's a novel of the same title, essentially. That's what it is. But it's a really strange story as it covers the love of a man with his teenage stepdaughter. Wait, what? I'm not even kidding. This is the real plot. This is about a man who falls in love with his teenage stepdaughter. Talk about forbidden love. What kind of debauchery of film is this? This can't even qualify as entertainment to audiences. How could this slip past regulators? If only there was some kind of commission or committee that could sit down and talk about what is and isn't appropriate to see on film. Almost like a board of somebody who would censor this kind of thing. Now how did that slip by? Turns out, Kubrick actually has a way with film and took special care and precaution in the way he filmed this movie so that it would specifically not be banned by that board. Take that, you prudes. Yes, the film then went on to enjoy moderate success at the box office and relatively good reviews. If you're into that kind of stuff, I would recommend checking it out. You sick nasties. Doing a complete 360 and walking away from this genre into the comedic world, Kubrick began work on his first masterpiece, the 1964 Cold War era Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb. Kubrick was really entering the danger zone when he was producing this film.
Danger zone!
Back then, apparently the topic of nuclear bombs wasn't exactly comedic gold, if you will. Especially considering you have two of the world's superpowers in the post-World War II era facing off in a nuclear game of chicken. However, it is interesting to note that Kubrick hadn't originally planned on it to be a comedy, as it was taken from Peter George's novel, Red Alert. While working on the film and script, Kubrick decided that too many of the ideas were just too funny to be taken seriously, which led to the decision to bill it as a comedy. The plot, starring Peter Sellers in 3 different roles as an insane general, triggers a path to nuclear holocaust that a war room full of politicians in general frantically try to stop. The plot was generally well received by audiences. The film got both the attention it deserved from the public as well as critical success and even meriting a nod to the artsiness or artistic value of the movie. In this movie, Kubrick was really starting to show his attention to detail by making a metaphor that the president, generals, and Russian ambassador were playing a game of poker. This was achieved by making the table covered in green baize, which would be totally fine if it weren't for the fact that the entire movie was shot in black and white. Also, the cockpit of the B-52 in the movie was absolutely correct, despite the fact that the bomber was still highly classified at that point. They reconstructed it completely from only pictures that the set builders could acquire. Because of his last hit, he enjoyed an overwhelming amount of success. He now had the financial capabilities to go on and take on whatever project he wanted. And with these finances and full artistic range, he could go into places he hadn't gone before, taking risks and going into genres that many would not go into. Kubrick would never be a one-movie man, constantly having multiple projects be worked on at once and splitting time between each one. Kubrick stayed busy up until the end of his life. Up next is arguably Kubrick's crowning achievement, an instant in the cult classic movies, a milestone in special effects for all of cinematic history, a magical blend of sci-fi and fantasy, and predictions for the future that you really can't say are that far off. Yes, I am talking about the 1968 production, 2001, A Space Odyssey. In cooperation with the author of the story The Sentinel, Arthur C. Clarke and Stanley Kubrick penned the screenplay based off the story. This movie has everything a Kubrick lover wants. Fantastic musical accompaniment, over-the-top special effects, overly dramatic and long tracking sequences, and is just plain all-around awesome. Seriously, this movie is one of the most groundbreaking films in all of sci-fi. It pretty much set the standard for all the movies that followed. The effects that take place in this movie are pretty much taken for granted nowadays. Most of the time, movies nowadays use CGI. Back then, there wasn't a whole lot of computer graphic interface or anything like that at all. They had to put everything in front of the screen. Everything had to be done through trickery, lies, and deceit. Take, for instance, all the zero-gravity scenes. You would just computerize all that, right? You couldn't do that back in 1968. Think about it. Kubrick is making one of the most thought-provoking films that takes place in space, and no one has even set foot on the moon yet. Speaking of the moon, Kubrick went into the extreme detail again, even making sure that all the equipment used on set could actually work on the moon. Somebody forgot to tell him that it wasn't being filmed there. Woodstock was not even for another year. That zero-gravity jogging scene, essentially a giant hamster wheel with a fixed camera. Then this scene with a floating pen, an idea that would be so simple now to make in CGI, but since CGI wasn't around yet, that's an actual pen. The scene nowadays would be so simple to take this pen and put into CGI and just have it floating there. Again, they couldn't do that. That's a real pen on the screen. So, how does it float? So how does he do it? Is it magic? Does the pen write with pixie dust? Or is maybe that pen secretly the wand of the great wizard Merlin? No, as it turns out this pen is actually just stuck to glass with two-sided tape. Well, wasn't that anticlimactic? By using simple cleverness, trickery, and camera angles, Kubrick is able to manipulate our minds into believing every last special effect in every second of the movie. There's a reason it won the Oscar for Best Special Effects. A strange movie that, according to Arthur C. Clarke, if you understand 2001 completely, we failed. We wanted to raise far more questions than we answered. Luckily for Arthur C. Clarke, he accomplished that. Many people didn't understand it, let alone even like it. During first screenings of the film, people walked out. They just couldn't handle it. It wasn't exactly the action-packed movie they expected. They just thought it was boring, complicated, and they just plain didn't get it. However, there was a notice by movie theater owners that there was an increasing number of young adults attending the film, who were especially enthusiastic about watching the Stargate sequence under the influence of psychotropic drugs. Well, now, why was this such a draw to the movie? What is such a... Nope, the movie's just crazy. If you really want to know how they filmed this scene, it wasn't computer generated or anything. It had something to do with cutting a slit in a black sheet and then moving the other sheet behind it, which had all the colors on. I really don't know. Just look at this diagram. This was just one of the many things adding to its box office success, even despite horribly negative reviews at first. Over time, though, it found more and more favor with movie critics. It even got a 4 out of 4 stars alongside a thumbs up from one of the best movie reviewers of all time, Roger Ebert. If you can handle 88 minutes without dialogue, this movie's for you. I highly suggest checking it out. Unless you don't like sci-fi, in which case, get out. Even more success after that last movie, Kubrick moved on to yet another controversial film, just because he likes to ruffle people's feathers. The 1971 crime drama, A Clockwork Orange, based on the Anthony Burgess novel of the same name. Pure satire of crime and punishment, this movie takes place in futuristic Britain where violence is ever prevalent in the criminal punishment system. There's not a whole lot to say about this movie other than it's really weird. It's one of those movies you have to actually see to believe. It's an experience, it's not actually a story per se, you've just gotta watch it. Although there are some questionable directing choices made by Kubrick, it still made a good movie. For example, in the scene where Alex's chest is getting stomped on, Kubrick favored realism instead of the fakeness of just not hitting him. So that's a real stomp. That actually resulted in cracked ribs. There's also the scene where Alex's eyes are being held open with the torture apparatus. The device was actually drying his eyes out, and an actual doctor had to sit beside him to apply eye drops so that McDowell, the actor, wouldn't go blind. If that wasn't enough, the apparatus scratched at McDowell's cornea and caused him further pain. In that scene, when he's begging and demanding and just crying out for help, wanting it to stop, it really begs the question, how much of this was acting? I bet Kubrick didn't even know. He probably didn't care. What he got out of it was the best acting he could get and the most realism he could get through those characters. All in all, the level of graphic content is enough to merit an X rating in the US. It's a good, wholesome movie for the whole family to enjoy. The kids love it. Despite all of this, it was a huge success and yet another cult classic in the Kubrick circuit of films. Time traveling from the future to the past, turning again to another change of pace, Kubrick worked on his next film in secrecy, an adaptation of William Makepeace Thackeray's 19th century novel, Barry Lyndon, a romantic drama about an Irishman who wins the heart of a widow and must assume her deceased husband's role in the aristocracy. Critics predicted that this movie wouldn't be very successful, but it wouldn't be a Kubrick film if they did. Premiering on December 18, 1975, it ended up grossing about $11 million. It only achieved moderate mediocrity in the US, but in the UK, it's considered one of the best films of all time. The big story here isn't so much about the movie as much as Kubrick. He was actually finally getting to build around his reputation for himself. The filming of the movie was a major turning point in the way the world saw Kubrick. His complete domination style of directing was becoming legendary at this point, as he demanded complete respect, cooperation, and perfection from every cast member and crew worker on the film. At this point, he had begun his infamous hard-working schedule, sometimes making actors repeat scenes over and over, dozens of times just to get the perfect shot. Most of the time, these were without break. Around this time, Kubrick also started developing his reputation as a recluse. He started wanting to hide more, get more secrecy, get away from people. He needed that sense of security. During the filming of Barry Lyndon, a film in Ireland, including the military, the Irish Republican Army declared him a possible threat, and this is believed to have added to his desire to hide himself away. Looking ahead now, Kubrick moved into the horror genre. He turned down the ability to direct a sequel to the 1973 movie The Exorcist, which was actually then directed by John Borman and consequently considered the worst in the series and if not one of the worst movies of all time. What are you going to do? Instead, Kubrick moved ahead to do an adaptation of Stephen King's novel The Shining. The 1980 film starring Jack Nicholson as the father of the family the story focuses on. The working father takes his family to an isolated hotel for the winter. Here, an evil spiritual presence influences the father to psychotically murder his family. While all this is going on, the son, played by Danny Lloyd, gains psychic future and past sight and sees horrific and gruesome images. General audiences loved the film. It was hugely successful, but critics, as per usual in the Kubrick genre, were not so kind. The critics didn't matter though. This was another cult classic added to the belt of Kubrick and his films. Who can forget the infamous scene where Jack is smashing down the door to kill his wife and he just peers in to say hello? I mean, come on, that was hilarious. It's even still referenced to this day. Remember all those pages and pages of just all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy? Well, as it turns out, to make it as authentic as possible, Kubrick had his secretary actually type out each and every last page of it. Because back then, it would have been very noticeable if you copied each page instead of individually typing them. If that's not enough for you, you gotta remember at this point, Kubrick's a world-renowned director. His movies are being shown in different countries around the world in different languages. Yes, that means that each and every language has a typed script of that. Every page, all these languages, each typed individually. Kubrick's feverish search for perfection didn't end there either. In this scene where Shelley Duvall swings a bat at the crazy Jack Nicholson, whether or not he was crazy before, during, and or after the film is highly debatable, the scene actually took 127 takes. The scene actually took 127 takes. And that horrified expression on Duvall's face isn't unreal either. Kubrick intentionally created a hostile environment toward Duvall by screaming and yelling at her constantly on and off set. This was so traumatizing that the actress's hair started falling out. Kubrick actually caused her hair to fall out. He yelled at her so much. By the end of it, it was qualifying as a medical condition. It probably said, "Traumatized by Stanley Kubrick." If there's still any doubt in your mind that Kubrick isn't an absolute perfectionist, here's a tidbit of information for you. The shooting was originally planned to take 17 weeks, but because Kubrick, it ended up being a year. Throughout all the inner workings and madness and traumatizing insight of Stanley Kubrick and the brutal treatment of all his crew, he had a soft spot. This soft spot was reserved for children such as Danny Lloyd. Danny Lloyd actually did not know he was filming a horror film. As a child, he never saw the horrific images and scenes of demented terror that was actually the film being produced. Instead, Kubrick would show him severely edited parts of the film to essentially convince him he was just being part of a boring movie where a family roams around an empty hotel. Was this actually an artistical choice? Or maybe he was actually trying to spare him the horror? Maybe he was trying to influence Danny Lloyd to actually be innocent in the film while still inciting all the terror that's going on around him. Lloyd did eventually watch the real film many years later as a teenager, and now everything he remembers suddenly makes a whole lot more sense. Whatever his reasoning was, Kubrick managed to spare this child the psychological torture and scarring for the rest of his life while still producing one of the most famous horror films of all time. After the horror of The Shining, Kubrick returned to the horror of war in his 1987 dramatization of the Vietnam War known as Full Metal Jacket, based on the book The Short Timers by Gustav Hansford. It took 7 years in order to properly depict the experiences and awful events of soldiers going into and during the war. There were actually rumors going around at the time that Kubrick was disillusioned and discouraged by the movies of the same genre being released at the same time. These included Platoon and Hamburger Hill. They were extreme successes, and Kubrick was worried that he would not be nearly as successful in these movies. Despite these worries, upon premiering, the film enjoyed high critical acclaim and audiences alike loved it. In a rare event for a Kubrick film, many, if not all, of the lines of R. Lee Ermey, the actor who played Gunnery Sergeant Hartman, are improvised. This was on account of Ermey's military experience in the Marine Corps of 11 years, rising to the rank of Staff Sergeant and eventually bestowed the honorary rank of Gunnery Sergeant. In another rare sight for a Kubrick film, Kubrick had nothing but praise for the actor's talents as a performer. We just got done covering how Kubrick was so traumatizing to his actors that he made their hair fall out. Now he's giving nothing but praise to an actor? This is extremely rare. In fact, Kubrick was so impressed at Ermey's ability to portray his character that there were usually only 2 or 3 takes per scene, which in itself is extremely rare thing for a Kubrick film, especially this far into his career. Going back to The Shining, 127 takes in one scene. 2 or 3? This is only a tiny, tiny fraction. A percentage that's probably just in the decimals. I don't know, what is it like? Like 0%? I'm not a mathematician, but it's really low. There were also quite a few things going on in Kubrick's family life at the time of this film. Kubrick married his 3rd wife, Christine, and together they had 3 children. IMDb even goes so far as to mention that he had extensively remodeled his house. I'm going to go out on a limb here, and I'm going to say that it wasn't exactly a personal decision to remodel his house. It was probably his wife, but I mean, hey, do what you gotta do, right? On the darker side of things, both Kubrick's parents passed away during the production of this film. His mother died on April 23, 1985 in LA at the age of 82, and his father died on October 19, 1983 in LA of bacterial pneumonia. This may have added to the already horribly dark tone of the movie. On the lighter side of family affairs, on January 20th, 1985, Stanley's daughter had a son, Alexander Philip Hopps. In 1997, Kubrick was given 2 of the film world's highest honors, winning the D.W. Griffith Award from the Directors Guild of America, as well as the Golden Lion Award at the 54th Venice International Film Festival. Just 2 years later, he would release his final piece of work. In late 1996, Kubrick began work on what would go on to become his very last film, Eyes Wide Shut, starring Tom Cruise and his then-wife Nicole Kidman. Kubrick got the idea from the author Arthur Schnitzler, the author of Tromnevelle, the inspiration for the film. This film explored the inner workings of marriage and the sexual aspect of the interaction. The film was so sexually explicit and graphic that Kubrick had a hard time achieving the R rating. Whether or not Kubrick was just trying to see how much nudity and lewdness and sexual content he could get on screen before it just being classified as a porno altogether is probably still highly up for debate. I'll take you on it. In order to block out some of the more sexually active scenes, in later editing, Kubrick placed bodies in front of the action as to cut down on the amount of lewdness. Released in 1999, the movie received the typical Kubrick polarized reviews of atrocious and a masterpiece. Even Kubrick himself believed it to be his best film. Sadly, he wouldn't be around long enough to see it in theaters, and it was his first #1 box office hit. Kubrick passed away March 7th, 1999, in his sleep of a heart attack, just 5 days after showing the movie to Warner Brothers. Just 5 days after. 5 days after showing the Warner Brothers producers what he had. Kubrick was in the process of producing AI, Artificial Intelligence, the project that was going to follow up Eyes Wide Shut. The project was then subsequently turned over to Steven Spielberg, who revealed to be a close friend of Kubrick's. These two would secretly talk to each other about the art of filmmaking. They both had a deep respect for each other's work and often chatted each other about ideas. They talked about AI for quite some time. Believing the project was more Steven Spielberg's speed, Kubrick gave the rights to him, and he went on to finish it. But whether or not Kubrick would have liked the 2001 product is one mystery that will never be solved. Kubrick was not only legendary as a director, but he was revolutionary in his cinematic vision. Kubrick didn't always know exactly what he wanted, but he sure as anybody's business knew what he didn't want. Kubrick was never so much as a director to focus on the dialogue of the film, but more the artistic side of cinematography. In this sense, you could even argue that Kubrick was more a cinematographer than a director. This was most likely sparked by his early work as a photographer for Look magazine, as he looked for the artistic value and ways to produce the most beautiful pictures on screen possible. Kubrick was never one to speak about his movies. He was relatively tight-lipped, and he often didn't even have an opinion of his own. The press would ask him what his movies were about, and he'd always reply that it was the best policy for the movie to speak for himself. He was a private man. He was relatively reclusive. In fact, not many people knew what he looked like. People would go up to his house and they would knock on the door and ask for Kubrick. He himself would answer the door and tell them that he wasn't home. But because of his private nature and his reclusiveness, the press would often come up with wild stories about him. In one famous moment, the press came up with a story that somebody had trespassed on his lawn and Kubrick shot him, and then for bleeding on his grass, he shot him again. It just goes to show that when you're really good at what you do, people just like to talk about you. If you're really interested in Stanley Kubrick and his workings, the best way to experience them is to go out and watch them. Get a real grip on what they are. Go out and watch all of his movies. I can guarantee you'll probably not like every single one, but if you do, that's good too. But then again, you've got to remember, he put in hard work, he put in time, he put in effort, and you've got to respect him for that. Kubrick once said, if it can be written or thought, it can be filmed.